Welcome, everyone, to this IISS panel on engaging Iran. This is the second in a series of events focused on policy issues relating to Iran, a series conceived and initiated by my colleague Dina Esfandiari. This panel on engaging Iran had its initiation before the latest series of events that have focused global attention on Iran. It was initiated before the plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in the United States was alleged by the U.S. Attorney General, and before the latest IAEA report on the nuclear activities of a possible military dimension, as the IAEA calls it. Our purpose at this discussion meeting is not to debate the veracity of those two issues, the information in the IAEA report or the information in the U.S. Attorney General's claims. It's neither to debate pro or con of Iran's nuclear program, but to talk about engaging with Iran at a time when engagement seems all the more distant and impossible, but as our invitation said, probably all the more necessary. I'm filibustering for a minute because I'm hoping that our third speaker will arrive momentarily. I'm afraid that I told him the wrong time, in which case his late arrival will be entirely my fault and not his. But I think we may begin anyway because this is a topic of great interest and serious importance. And we have to lead off with the discussion three experts who have been engaging with Iran in various forms for many years in their respective fields. I will ask the Right Honorable Lord Lamont of Lerwick to start off the discussion. He's speaking today in his position as chairman of the British-Iranian Chamber of Commerce. He invited me to speak at the chamber earlier this year, and in a way I'm returning the favor or the request. Everybody, I think, knows Lord Lamont has a rich career in statesmanship and politics in this country, including as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1990 to 1993, and a long and illustrious parliamentary career. Lord Lamont, over to you to talk about 10 minutes, if you will, on some of the economic issues.
Mark, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. I feel I'm here slightly under false pretenses because I certainly wouldn't describe myself as an expert in Iran. I am, as Mark said, chairman of the British-Iranian Chamber of Commerce, which is something I do largely because I have become very interested in Iran. I'm much more interested in the politics of Iran than I am in business. I have been, and was how I got involved with the Chamber, a director of two companies that did business with Iran. One of them was more or less expropriated by the Iranian government, which wasn't a very encouraging way of learning about business in Iran. And the other is finding it very difficult doing business in Iran and has gradually been lessening and diminishing its involvement there. But as I say, I found the experience of interacting sometimes with Iranian officials and Iranian businessmen and going to Iran has been a very interesting one. And I have found that some of the impressions that I had were not borne out actually with the reality of dealing with Iran. I have to say, however, that I have become more disillusioned with Iran in recent months and in the past year, in that I've had the experience that some of the people I've been dealing with in Tehran have been arrested, and one has felt firsthand the the pain of that, and it is something I utterly condemn. And when I first got interested in Iran, the climate was very different from what it is there today. I don't know when President Ahmadinejad says that Iran has no military intention with its nuclear program, whether he is telling the truth or not telling the truth. But I do know he is not telling the truth when he says there are no political prisoners in Iran. There are thousands of political prisoners in Iran, and I completely condemn it. I share the frustration of many people at the way the negotiations or attempted negotiations with Iran on the nuclear program have gone. But I do not believe, and I'm not saying this out of any interest or anything, but out of genuine conviction, I do not believe that the present policies of the West of sanctions are going to work. I was, for a while, a member of a House of Lords committee that did an inquiry into sanctions and reviewed the operation of sanctions, not sanctions against Iran, but sanctions historically as a tool of government policy. And it really came to the conclusion that sanctions had very rarely, if ever, affected a political objective. And I have certainly followed what's happened in Cuba. I visited Cuba. I believe that the regime in Cuba would have fallen long ago if it had not been for sanctions. I do not believe that the sanctions against Iraq helped our policy at all. I think, if anything, they made the objectives of the West much more difficult. And I feel much the same is happening in Iran. If sanctions were going to work, I would back them. I don't know what will work, but I know what won't work, and sanctions are not going to work in Iran. That is not to say that they are not having an effect. The Iranian economy is in a terrible mess. Inflation is high, probably higher than the official statistics say. Unemployment is high, again, probably higher than the official statistics say. There is plenty of money for President Ahmadinejad to slosh around in a rather discretionary basis in a very political way. Sanctions, as I know from the members of the Chamber of Commerce, and most of the members that we have are Anglo-Iranian, Iranian businesses, many of them small businesses, not doing anything that could be remotely suspicious. Most of them are finding their livelihoods in danger. They're finding it is very difficult for them, even if they are just exporters of pistachio nuts or carpets, they are finding life extremely difficult. And many of them very much resent the impact of sanctions, which they feel are hurting ordinary people rather than making an impact on the regime. I draw a distinction between the sanctions of the UK government, the sanctions of the EU, and the sanctions of the US. The former two are much more targeted at materials relating to the nuclear program, targeted at individuals who are thought to be involved in the nuclear program or who are thought to be involved in alleged terrorist activities. The US sanctions are far wider, both the declared sanctions and the undeclared sanctions of the United States, because the United States is actually operating a system of trying to impose its own laws on other countries in an extraterritorial way. And the way this operates is that the US Treasury, in ways that it will not admit publicly, actually goes and leans on banks who are financing ordinary day-to-day business, like possibly pistachios or carpets or any activity that would be perfectly legal, and says, if you continue to finance this business with this company that is operating in Iran, your bank cannot do any business in the United States. And they have a leverage over any company that is financed by a bank that has any connection with the United States. Now, that is not a policy that I think the United States is always very open about. It is, I think, not the first attempt by the United States to impose extraterritorially its laws and its practices on other countries, but it seems to me something that is counterproductive, and it is something that is much resented. An example would be, many people in this room will have heard of IATA, the International Association of Travel Agents. They will now not accept payments to do with Iran Air or Mahan Air. They will not clear them. This simply means that some travel agents cannot do business with those airlines. Those airlines are flying in and out of Iran perfectly legally. If it is legal to go to Iran, if it is legal to leave Iran and go to America, as it is, what is the point of opposing these sanctions in this backdoor way? We have a similar situation where some airlines at Heathrow, and I think this included, though I stand to be corrected, British Midland, who fly to Tehran, can't refuel at Heathrow. So what happens is that the plane taking off at Tehran takes off for a few minutes, touches down in Kent in order to refuel again, and then flies on to Tehran. Now, is this really a sensible policy? All this is doing is making life very difficult for people traveling, adding to their frustrations. There is nothing illegal about going to Iran. There is nothing illegal about leaving Iran. The effect of this general boycott makes it more difficult for people to import things openly. It drives people towards connections with smuggling. If you're connected with smuggling, you're dealing with the Revolutionary Guards, you're dealing with the Iranian government, you become captured by them. So I very much agree. I think I've made my point about sanctions. I was interested to see that Fareed Zakaria, who the editor of Newsweek, who has been quite a strong supporter of liberal interventionism, of the United States policy in Afghanistan and in Iraq, came to exactly the same conclusion in an article he wrote after he visited Tehran just recently. Quite honestly, I feel if we had followed exactly the opposite policy and had completely free trade, other than for things associated with the nuclear program with Iran, I think we would have lessened the authoritarianism, lessened the flight to government, to the Revolutionary Guards, assuming more and more economic power. And I think it is a great pity that the United States has pursued a policy both of keeping Russia and Iran out of the WTO, which would compel them to observe certain rules of behavior economically and would have made it easier for the private sector, private wealth, people independent of power of the government. We obviously do need some combination of pressure on Iran with incentives. That is, of course, easier to say than to identify precisely. I do think that in dealing with Iran, we have to have regard to Iraq's own security concerns. Talking about Iran today without remembering the Iran-Iraq war is rather like talking about Britain in the late 1930s without remembering the First World War. It is not surprising that Iran is not very friendly to a Western presence in Afghanistan or a continued Western presence in Iraq. But at the same time, we should remember that Iran actually helped the American invasion of Afghanistan, and all it got in return was being labeled the axis of evil. I think, and this is a tricky subject because of what the Chairman Mark referred to, the recent alleged incident in Washington. I think one of the difficulties that the West has in engaging with Iran is also the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I feel in some ways the Western relationship with those two countries has become somewhat lopsided. The West regards Saudi as a moderate regime, although in many ways, whether one was talking about democracy, women's rights, freedom of speech, or indeed connections with terrorism, there is quite a lot that Saudi Arabia has to answer for on all those issues. And you know, for the West, as the United States has gone, to go on selling arms to Saudi Arabia, who is not remotely going to be attacked by Iran, I think our relationship between those two competing powers in the region has been very myopic. And actually, you know, the connections, if by terrorism one is talking about Al-Qaeda, you know, there are consequences that come from Saudi Arabia that have flowed through to Al-Qaeda in a way that has not been the case from Iran. Iran itself suffers from terrorism and from Sunni terrorism and from groups connected to Al-Qaeda, and of course it has suffered from groups like the MEK, the MKO, and I'm not sure that it was entirely wise of certain leading figures in the United States suddenly to decide that they were backing the MEK, the MKO. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I've sort of overrun my 10 minutes. I'm delighted to see the real expert, Richard Dalton, has now arrived here. As I've said, I was intending to speak after Richard, and the point I wanted to make was really that although I don't know the answers, I don't know the right way of approaching this, I believe that the path we're on is the wrong one. I believe that sanctions, while they're having effect, will not have the political effect that people believe they will have, and it is political effects and political change. I think it is completely counterproductive in that sense. But I think we have to continue with a combination of pressure of a different kind, plus incentives. We did deal with China and Russia, two countries whose human rights records did not stand in the way of our having a dialogue with them, and we did address their regional security concerns, certainly in the case of China. Everybody says Obama's approach to Iran was rejected. I'm not sure that that is entirely right. The websites and the press reports I read, I notice the rhetoric applied to Obama by Iran is very different from that applied to the previous government under George W. Bush. But of course, what Iran has said is that it wants the facts change rather than just the words change. Of course, that has to happen on both sides. But I do not believe that the present policy is one that is going to prove fruitful. I'm sure we're about to see it heightened. We're about to see more sanctions, and I think the results will be just to hit the private sector more, make the country more dominated economically by bodies like paramilitary bodies and bodies like the Revolutionary Guards, and more state-dominated than ever, and that makes it more difficult, actually, for freedom of expression and civil society to flourish. So I do think we need to rethink our approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Lamont. As I mentioned to the audience beforehand, it was my mistake to give Sir Richard the wrong time, and my deep apologies. If I could ask Sir Richard to come to the podium, and I will then ask Dr. Mahan Abedin to speak next. Mahan is the Director of Research at the Center for the Study of Terrorism here in London. He's also affiliated with the New Delhi-based Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He's a frequent commentator in the international media on issues particularly involving Iran. I see him all the time on Asia Times Online, and happy to see you in person, and please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I don't know if I'm using this correctly. Is this on?
It's on. It's
okay.
On.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction and also the invitation. It's an honor to be here in your presence. I'm going to be talking about something rather specific, namely Iran's defense doctrine, or lack of it. And I'm going to start off with a very big supposition. namely that some of the allegations in the IAEA's report are actually true, that there is a military dimension to Iran's nuclear program. And if we take that very, very big supposition, how will that affect the entire idea or the approaches regarding on how to engage Iran? But I will state at the outset, since I've just learned that this thing is on the record, that by Iran's nuclear program having a military dimension, there is two very important distinctions to note. There is a huge difference between a country having an active nuclear weapons program and a country actually seeking nuclear latency. And I believe Iran is seeking the latter, namely the ability, the infrastructure, the know-how to accumulate all of that, with a view perhaps somewhat further down the horizon, 10, 20 years from now, in a more favorable political environment, with a view perhaps to weaponizing ultimately. But certainly in the foreseeable future, I don't think the Islamic Republic of Iran has the intention to produce nuclear weapons. For one thing, Iran doesn't even have the posture of a nuclear weapon state. In order to actually have these weapons and be able to deploy them and to integrate them into your defense doctrine and into your wider strategic profile, you need to work on the posturing, the software, the intellectual positioning, and Iran has done none of that, at least not publicly. But nuclear latency is a different ballgame altogether. It's referred to sometimes in the media as the Japan option, namely you have the infrastructure in place, the know-how in place, and once the political conditions are more favorable, you can generate enough political will to go down that road. But let me just begin with Iran's defense doctrine, or lack of it. Now, unlike the United Kingdom, Iran doesn't have something called the Strategic Defense Review. There's no official defense doctrine. That said, there are a number of institutions who work tirelessly on this matter. There's, of course, the country's main defense organizations, the Defense College of the regular military. There's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that has several outfits that work on this issue of defense doctrine, of working out how best to tailor capabilities to Iran's strategic profile. And there's also Iran's academic community, which is also very active on this issue. Now, usually when we discuss Iran, the discussion tends to be very reductive. We tend to focus on factions. 10 years ago, it was the reformists versus the conservatives. Nowadays, it's elements within the conservative factions facing off against each other. And we tend to reduce everything into that paradigm. And we tend to forget that Iran really is a proper country. It's a very large country. There are many, many elements to that place. But I would point out on the issue of defense, on the issue of strategic positioning, and also on the issue of even nuclear weapons acquisition, there's broad consensus in Iran. And it goes beyond the political elites. It connects to the media, it connects to the academic community, and a lot of work has been done on the software side, on the intellectual side, in generating this consensus over the past 30 years. I was very glad when the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Lamont, mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, because I think Iran's defense doctrine, if you can call it that, in origin is related to the Iran-Iraq war and the experiences of the war, in particular the latter years. Iran started the Iran-Iraq war without any strategic military capability whatsoever. The country had no indigenous defense industry to speak of. There was something like 12 to 15 small workshops. That was all back in the 1980s. Iran didn't have any ballistic missiles to speak of, so when the Iraqis were actually lobbing missiles against Iran, Iran had to acquire missiles from Syria and to a lesser extent also from Libya. However, by the end of the war, a lot of work was being done in producing an indigenous defense capability, namely in the ballistic missile sphere. Now, there's a lot of elements that go into shaping a country's defense review. I'm not going to speak about some of these because clearly time is lacking, but there's the country's geography, the country's history, its entire historical experience. All of these go into shaping and forming a country's strategic profile. And Iran is no exception. But the Iran-Iraq war is the absolute key. And Iran certainly sees Iraq as its potential enemy. Even now, even in the wake of the American-led invasion of Iraq, which has altered Iraq's strategic profile from one of a proximate enemy of Iran to a potential ally. But even now, Iranian defense planning is very much geared towards viewing Iraq as a potential military adversary. And certainly the Iranian defense colleges and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have comprehensive plans in place to meet any threat from immediate neighbors. But in view of the ideological nature of Iran's political system, and more specifically in view of the conflict between Iran and the United States over the past 30 years, the Iranian defense establishment, not so much the regular military, but certainly the more ideological components of the defense establishment, to wit the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they view a potential military conflict with the United States as the country's most catastrophic threat. And much of the work that has gone on, both on the software side, on the intellectual side, and also on the capability side, has been geared towards meeting that potential threat. Now, I won't labor some of the key points. For instance, Iran's support of non-state groups. You're all aware of that. That is a key feature of Iranian policy, of working with non-state actors in the Middle East, partly to compensate for the country's lack of diplomatic clout, but also to compensate for the fact that it's very effective. I mean, Iran's policy in the Middle East has really worked because it's kept threats at bay. One of the reasons that Israel doesn't attack Iran, even though it really wants to, is because it realizes the consequences are really unforeseeable. The scope for unintended consequences are just simply too costly. So that's one side of it. But there's also, besides the development of a ballistic missile capability, which is well proven. I mean, Iran today has the ability to produce mid-range ballistic missiles from scratch, and that technology is indigenous, and that's widely acknowledged. But beyond that, there's a lot of other capability has been produced over the past 20 years, some of which is beyond verification, and no doubt the Iranians do exaggerate. There's been no independent verification of the operability of some of the devices and some of the weapon systems that have been produced, for instance, the drones, the fighter jets, some of the tanks. However, they do exist. They exist, they physically exist. How effective they are in a combat scenario, that remains to be seen. And also, if you look at the rhetoric of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, over the past 10 years, but certainly over the past couple of years, the scenarios which they set out, these are very real scenarios. They talk about a potential attack on Iran by the United States and how they would respond. And I think one of the reasons why certainly elements in the United States military and now even the defense secretary are backing off from the military option is because, like the Israelis, they realize that the scope for unintended consequences is simply too high. But let's go back to this idea of nuclear latency. How would that affect Iran's defense doctrine? Iran's defense doctrine is primarily defensive in nature. Even when it relates to the country's immediate neighbors, for example, Iraq, which is even now seen as a potential military adversary, the idea is not to have an offensive posture. The idea is to meet that threat. And certainly the historical records would affirm that. Certainly by all credible accounts, Iraq was the initiator of hostilities in 1980. But even a conflict with the United States and her allies, that would be defensive in nature. I don't believe, despite some of the rhetoric, that Iran would ever initiate hostilities. But nonetheless, Iran has the capability and certainly the will to respond to that threat. Now, one of the reasons I think Iran certainly seeks nuclear latency is to banish this scenario altogether, the scenario of conflict with the United States. How credible that is, that remains to be seen. But I think on the wider question of engagement, some of the presuppositions that we have is that if Iran had that capability, a nuclear latency capability, that would make engagement harder. That may be the case, but I would argue otherwise. Just to play the role of a devil's advocate this morning, if I may. But I think that could potentially make engagement easier because Iran, as a state, despite the fact that it has many things to be proud of in view of its history, in view of its role in that region, in view of its highly educated human resources, it's a state that's very diffident from a geopolitical point of view. Iran lacks self-confidence. One of the reasons they back non-state actors, one of the reasons for this vitriolic rhetoric is indeed because of this lack of self-confidence. A nuclear latent capability could potentially bridge that gap. Even on very specific issues like Iran's support for non-state actors, that may diminish if that lack of self-confidence is overcome to some extent. And this is a big point I'm trying to make here, and I may be very wrong, but I think even Iran's view on the Arab-Israeli conflict, one of the biggest stumbling blocks, one of the biggest issues between Iran and the United States, the fact that Iran actively opposes a peace process between the Arabs and the Israelis, that strategic mindset may also alter if Iran develops a nuclear latent capability. Now, I'd just like to address some of the issues raised by the Honourable Mr. Lamont earlier. I share his view that sanctions are not effective, but on the question of free trade, I think that's problematic. Certainly the Revolutionary Guard Corps has developed economic clout in recent years, in part because of the sanctions, but that's not the whole story. There are wider political variables at play, and even beyond that specific point, beyond the Revolutionary Guards, the very nature of the Iranian economy makes free trade quite problematic. The strategic layers of the Iranian economy are controlled by state actors. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard is one of them. I would argue, in fact, the Revolutionary Guard's role is not so problematic. What is really problematic is the role of these bunyads, the foundations, who are deeply corrupt, who are not transparent, who are not accountable. At least the IRGC has the ability to deliver on projects. But these are foundations that literally suck money out of the economy and without, as I said, in an atmosphere and in a spirit of lack of transparency and lack of accountability. What would be more effective, perhaps, is Western engagement with Iran to open up the economy. Iran does need advice, not just at the government sector, but the private sector. And I think the Iranians in general would welcome an opening of that nature. But let me make this point. I don't think there's any tool in place, as far as pressures are concerned, I don't think there's any tool in place that will work, because Iran's decision to develop nuclear latency is of the deepest strategic kind. No pressure will work. Even if you impose the toughest of sanctions, let's say, this is highly unlikely, but let's say even the oil and gas sector was sanctioned en masse, that's not going to work. That will not alter that strategic calculus. A military conflict will not work. Irrespective of what physical damage it inflicts on the infrastructure, it's not going to alter that strategic calculus. On the political dimension also, even if you leave behind the factional politics, I mean, as I said, 10 years ago, the center of gravity was between the conservatives and the reformists. Today, when we talk about Iranian politics, we tend to think about, just a couple of more minutes. We tend to think about Mr. Ahmadinejad versus Mr. Khamenei. But I would firstly, these differences, as far as the country's defense doctrine are concerned, these differences mostly center on style rather than substance. None of these groups alter fundamentally in their view of Iran's strategic profile and what capability Iran needs to have in place to interface with the world. But I would go even beyond that. Even if you get rid of the current system altogether, whatever replaces that is unlikely to have a different worldview as far as the country's defense doctrine is concerned. And the elements in place in Iran that work on these issues, certainly on the intellectual and software side, they are very wide, they're very vast. They go beyond the government. As I said, there's certainly a consensus in place that the strategies and the approaches that have been adopted since the Iran-Iraq war, they're right to meet the country's threats. And I think it's very important that Mr. Lamont mentioned Iran's threats, the way Iran perceives its own strategic environment. I think if you want to understand that country, you certainly have to see it from the point of view of that country's elites to some extent. And I think on that point, I will leave it.
Thank you very much, Mahan, for giving us a different picture than the one we often hear here. Sir Richard, if you could finish off with your views. I think everyone knows Sir Richard Dalton served as a British ambassador to Iran from 2002 to 2006. He's currently an associate fellow at the Middle East and North African program of the Chatham House. He, in his diplomatic career, served elsewhere in the Middle East and has a rich range of experience and from which to draw on. So over to you, Sir Richard.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And I'm very sorry to have missed the beginning of your remarks. I am an optimist, although I am aware that I've been coming here and also speaking in my own institution, Chatham House, for a number of years on that topic. And those of us who are optimists find it very hard to sustain that, and particularly so at the moment. My main thesis is that at the moment the diplomatic track is operating on both sides on incredibly narrow tram lines. Excessive restrictions are being placed by both sides on the way in which they approach the subject of negotiations. We see a dogmatic approach on both sides, and this is contributing to a very dangerous situation. And my second thesis is that, and this is where the optimism comes in, that it is, I believe, still possible to find a package that meets many, if not most, of the essential requirements of the United States and Iran, and still leaves the region in a safer situation than it is at present, and leaves the non-proliferation regime stronger. There's a certain mirror imaging between Iran and the United States. Both, for example, are feeling injured. They both believe that they have been rebuffed, that the other side is insincere and is proceeding on a predetermined agenda. So the United States maintains that what happened in 2009 onwards was a straightforward rebuff by Iran of a genuine opening from Iran. And Iran, particularly the supreme leader, looks back over a longer canvas of approaches, including the Lebanon hostages, including cooperation over Afghanistan, including the way in which Ahmadinejad has been signaling willingness to talk to the United States, and he sees that getting Iran nowhere. So my final principal thesis is that I don't think it's any point in our governments on the six playing the blame game of who is more negative. I think it's too serious an issue now. So where are we? In summary, Iran is defiant. It believes it's gaining strength while the position of the United States and its allies decline. At the same time, its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency is undoubtedly insufficient, both for the safety of the region and the future of the non-proliferation regime. And the reasons why that is the case has been very much on parade in the media following the IAEA report, with the clear evidence there of the notorious possible military dimensions of Iran's program, to use the IAEA language. Iran's credibility about its program having been entirely peaceful from the start is completely shredded. Their actual progress in defying undoubted obligations upon them, the gradual accumulation of 20% enriched uranium, the developments at Fordow are particularly worrying. The confidence deficit is still huge. There's no progress on moving Iran towards the observance of the additional protocol. And although we don't have, I believe, the texts of the recent exchange between Lady Ashton and Mr. Jalili, it's clearly been inconclusive on the subject of renewing talks and may even be discouraging. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody in the room who can enlighten us on that. The response from the six, well, I think remarks by the British Foreign Secretary in Parliament on the 9th of November are typical. We want a negotiated solution, he said. We are prepared to have further talks, but only if Iran is prepared to engage in serious negotiations about its nuclear program without preconditions. If not, we must continue to increase the pressure, and we are considering with our partners a range of additional measures to that effect. but he didn't vouchsafe to Parliament any detail as to what those measures might be, leaving his own audience and, of course, the wider British public completely in the dark about whether any such measures could address the objective which he posits. I believe there is a degree of open-mindedness about in some of the six powers on the eventual content of negotiations, but they are still stressing that there has to be conformity with the United Nations Security Council resolutions, meaning in essence suspension, and we know from 6 years futile negotiation on suspension of the enrichment program where that is likely to lead us. They still frame their policy in terms of preventing a nuclear weapons capability, but as we know, much has been done already, which indicates that Iran is approaching the point of having that capability, although I do agree with the previous speakers that latency is the most likely of the different options for Iran at present rather than weaponization. So I believe that the policy of the six is in a blind alley, that it's unrealistic. I mean, to give one example, and again, maybe there's somebody from the United States who could comment on this, but did the United States Secretary of State really believe that the kind of sanctions which she hinted at in her BBC Persian service interview will induce a rethink in Tehran about the terms being offered by the six now? My own view is that a gap is opening up between what people believe in saying to themselves in private and what they're saying in public, and I'm not sure that the six are convinced that they believe that more punishment is going to accomplish anything positive. So, what are the pieces of advice that I would like to see more debate on? I would start by asking for more frankness from the governments of the six about the limits of current policy, including the limits and dangers of the military option. I'd like more frankness on what is currently driving policy at the moment, which I believe is in many cases that which is most convenient for short-term political considerations, particularly in Israel and the United States. And I'd like to see less emphasis on pressure and punishment and more on constructing a ladder down which both sides can climb to a more positive way of proceeding. Secondly, I think there should be more realization that if this issue is left, it doesn't get better. In fact, it gets worse. So we need to start maybe with more of an effort to align policy within the six. I mean, the fact is that there is a greater disparity of view within this negotiating body now than I believe at any previous time, and this is not a good recipe for presenting a set of coordinated and clear messages to the negotiating partner. We should stop overbidding, meaning that the history of the negotiations suggests that we had tended to offer too little and to offer it too late. So we need to make a leap, and we need to make a leap, I believe, to a different line of defense for peace and security, and to base that on a risk management approach, very difficult, of course, for those in the region, particularly the GCC states and Israel, to accept such a thing. But it should be based, I believe, on no deployment of nuclear weapons by Iran, achieved by guarantees of non-diversion of nuclear material, again through operation of IAEA processes plus, and that's very important that there should be more than is in the additional protocol by way of limitations and restraints and monitoring on the Iranian nuclear program. The whole set, of course, backed by the existing levels of deterrence, including nuclear deterrence, which I believe are and can be in the future effective. Finally, as made quite clear by Lord Lamont, we have to address the wider regional issues. And particularly in the UK, we need to be a little braver in recognizing that currently UK interests aren't being very well served by the positions being adopted by the Six. So those are my general considerations, but you may ask, what of the detail? What of the way of actually settling the question? What would be the end state around which this vision of a safer region and a more secure non-proliferation regime would resolve itself? Well, obviously I'm obliged to say something about what I mean about a new line of defense based on non-deployment of nuclear weapons achieved through non-diversion of nuclear material. I think we should be aiming for a three-part deal. I think the first part is clearly those limits on the operation of the Iranian nuclear program, coupled with additional restrictions, as I said, possibly export of the product from the enrichment program, so long as there is no domestic Iranian nuclear energy program that justifies major production of low-enriched uranium, coupled with consideration of ways of assuring at that time, when there is a significant Iranian civil nuclear energy program, sufficient import of yellow cake into Iran. Secondly, we clearly have to deal with the fate of the 20% enriched material in Iran, which is linked, as you know, to the question of the future of the Iranian research reactor. We also have to deal under this heading of building confidence, where none exists at present, on the IAE process under which it would get answers to their questions on possible military dimensions. Now, ways of facilitating such an agreement have been suggested in the literature on many occasions. One useful idea would be drawn from the Libya experience, under which if Iran was prepared to account for that work, to change its position on whether or not it's done that work at all, it would be able to get an assurance that this would not lead to yet more punishment for past misdeeds. And the third part of a negotiation should clearly be the regional issues, Lebanon, the Middle East peace process, but above all, because it's going to be very difficult to reach agreement on those, the regional security context in the Persian Gulf. This is always the ghost at these feasts. Lip service is paid to dealing with the huge deficit in regional security arrangements in the Gulf, despite the fact that there's been more wars there than anywhere else. But it is a potential way through to reducing the misunderstandings and hostility that exists across that waterway at the moment, while also enabling each side to feel more secure at a lower level of armaments. Needs to be up there as part of a process which you would not call a grand bargain, because that's far too ambitious, but I think you are entitled to call it a grand agenda. In other words, the launching of a process under which there would be a progressive reduction of the areas of tension and disagreement, which are presently so acute. How would you start such a process? Always the problem. The Russian proposal is out there. Again, I'm not clear what its fate is going to be. It seems to be still alive, but only just. It would be a way of beginning to address this wide agenda that I'm talking about, but I think it has to be recognized that it's not a full answer on its own. Similarly, taking up the proposal by President Ahmadinejad with slightly more vigor than has been since he made it, that if the research reactor fuel was provided, Iran would cease enriching to 20%. So there is material there for in either of those for a potential preliminary gain. So if this is an obvious way to go, as I believe it is there actually any chance in the short term that governments will adopt it? And at the moment, one has to say that the prospects for constructive engagement are extremely poor. But instead of both sides, Iran thinking that continued sanctions is the least objectionable course, and the six believing that, or some of the six, that further sanctions is also the least objectionable course, I think it is right for our publics to expose these arguments to greater scrutiny and to see whether a advance to a more positive cycle on the lines that I've suggested might be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. We now have about a half an hour left in our assigned schedule. I think what I'd like to do is open the floor to a series of comments. After maybe a half dozen, we'll revert to the speakers for a response to those questions posed to them or those issues raised for which they have particular competence. And then we'll see how much time we have to go back for a second round. So in the usual fashion, if you catch my eye, state your name and position, even though you know that I know you very well, for the benefit of the audience. So, Frank, and then there should be yes, wait for the microphone to come along.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mark. Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent. One thing that's not being mentioned here, which I feel is slightly the elephant in the room, is the presence of the US Navy in the Gulf. The Iranians, as you all know, consider the Gulf to be a Persian lake. They call it Khalij-e-Fars, the Gulf of Persia. And to my mind, having lived in the Gulf, on the Arab side of the Gulf, and occasionally crossed over to the Iranian side and heard both sides, I don't think you're ever going to really get Iran to feel comfortable while there is the presence of major US forces in the Gulf. At the same time, the Arab Gulf states are not going to feel comfortable if those forces withdraw. They see them as their insurance policy. That, to me, is perhaps one of the bigger issues here. Iran has built up its military strength in the Gulf because it feels threatened. It feels that it is the natural policeman of that Gulf.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the fourth row. He already has a microphone, so we'll
thanks. Khan, Sajid Ali Khan. Actually, this really, I was going to say that...
Speak a little bit louder, please.
With the excellent presentation, nobody had mentioned Saudi Arabia in this context. And of course, my previous speech, I did bring in Arabia. So that's the main point I wanted to make, apart from saying that Persia, like China, and India, have been essentially defensive for the last couple of 100 years.
Thank you. Ben Berry in the front row, and then next after that, Amy Kellogg in the third row.
Could I thank the second speaker for his presentation on Iranian doctrine, and his analysis of its defensive roots. But of course, President Ahmadinejad's rhetoric about Israel is the opposite of that. How much of his rhetoric reflects the views of the Iranian defense establishment?
Thank you. Yes, Amy?
Amy Kellogg with Fox News. I'm just wondering if any of you have any information or thoughts about the explosions that occurred at the missile depot over the weekend, and if there's any speculation that may have been a sort of sabotage, or how that may impact the situation as things sort of hot up or become more tense after the release of the IAEA report last week.
Thank you. And then in the second row, Kim Singh Gupta.
Kim Singh Gupta from The Independent. Really following up from Amy's question, Lord Lamont mentioned Iran facing terrorism from Sunni groups, Al-Qaeda, etc. in Fars. Can you possibly talk about the role of state actors, if there is any, in attacks inside Iran? Any evidence at all of the Israelis being involved, or the Americans, or for that matter, the UK?
Thank you. And then in the third row, the gentleman.
Sam Koshku from London School of Economics, Diplomacy and International Strategy. Considering the fact that the U.S. is a declining power in the world, and as it was mentioned, this is possibly becoming Iran's gain as a consequence, if Iran continues to succeed in receiving support from Russia and China, how do you strategically assess the unforeseeable potential conflict between Iran and Israel, since it is much argued that there are foreseeable patterns and trends of power shift from the West to the East, which is specifically China?
I'm sorry, we didn't quite get the gist of that. Can you give us the gist of the question again?
In a shorter explanation, since it's much argued in the strategic studies that there is possibly a trend of power shift to the East from the West, which it indicates that Iran will gain more influence with its relationship to China and Russia. How could you possibly see the future of the potential conflict and tension between Iran and Israel as it's gaining power through its relationship to the eastern part of the hemisphere?
Yeah. Okay, Iran-Israel potential. And six now. I think we've got six, so why don't we, I think that's good, yes, I said we'd have. We'll come back to the panel for responses to those questions or issues that, and I think we'll start in the order that we proceeded. So Lord Lamont, if you don't mind, and then Mahan, and then Richard, and then we'll go back to the audience.
Right, well, with six questions.
You don't have to take all of them, but you can take those that you feel competent.
Well, I'll deal with all of them very briefly. The U.S. Navy in the Gulf, Frank Gardner's question, I entirely agree with that. And actually, I noticed that Admiral Mullen was suggesting that there ought to be more informal contacts between the Iranian Navy and the U.S. Navy because of the risk of an accident. And, of course, we have the precedent of an accident with the shooting down of an Iranian airline in which several hundred people were killed, something that is always forgotten in the West, always forgotten by the United States, or when it is raised, it's just said, well, it was an accident. But I agree with you. The presence of the fleet there is seen very much as a threat by Iran, and I noticed that in the presidential debates there has been talk about reinforcing this with more American troops being sent into more ships being sent into the Gulf, and indeed I think there was something said about that by Obama just last week, and I think this is something we have to take into account, and I think we have to look at ways in which in the long run the United States presence could be reduced and more of it borne by other people on a joint basis in the Gulf. There's very good cooperation between Oman and Iran, actually, on the Straits. Saudi Arabia, gentlemen, I did mention Saudi Arabia in my speech. I obviously didn't get my point across, but I think the West just tends to regard Saudi Arabia as a moderate regime. Well, it's moderate in the sense that it's more friendly to the West, but by any objective standard, I'm not really sure it can be regarded as moderate. The rhetoric of Ahmadinejad, and is this consistent with the third question, the defensive strategy that was outlined? I think it is, actually. I've seen many, Ahmadinejad's famous remark about wiping Israel off the map. I've seen 6 different versions from the Foreign Office of a translation of those remarks. I think they can be consistent with the reality. There is a tendency, I think, for overblown rhetoric, and I think that can be consistent. I entirely agree with what the second speaker said about the use of proxies as a form of defense, and a very effective form of defense. I always remember Larijani saying, if Iran is attacked, expect Israel in a wheelchair, i.e. there will be retaliation from Hamas and Hezbollah if we are attacked. The question was raised about, was there sabotage, any suggestion of it in an explosion at a missile depot? I don't know about that, but the next question was about terrorism within Iran. There obviously, and was there any involvement, was there any evidence of foreign involvement? Well, I'm not the one who's going to point the finger or name the country that everybody in the room might imagine, but we do see that Iranian scientists are shot every 3 or bombed every 3 or 4 months in the streets of Tehran. I don't believe those incidents are invented. Somebody obviously has a motive for assassinating Iranian scientists. There was a very, very long article in the New Yorker some months ago by Seymour Hersh about covert programs. I'm not saying this was true, but I just draw your attention to it. An immensely long article, maybe 20, 30,000 words, all about a covert program for Sunni and Baluchi separatists within Iran, and how this had had approval by members of Senate and Congress. The last point was about the relationship with the East, and as power shifts to the East, does this make it more difficult? I think it does. China is a key actor here, and Iran is doing more and more trade with China. More and more payments are going through other countries as well, and I think unless China is kept on board, it is extremely difficult for sanctions to work. I heard just last week that the Iranians are having much more difficulty in getting payment from China, which would be, I think, an extremely serious development from the Iranian point of view, if that report is correct.
Thank you very much, Lord Lamont. Mahan, would you like to add some thoughts to that set of answers?
I'll try to tackle 3 or 4 of these questions, if I may. I'll start with the question from the gentleman, since it was specifically addressed to me. It's a very good question. I think, first of all, in regard to the actual statement that was made in October 2005, there are indeed various interpretations of that, but what Ahmadinejad did say, he was referring... Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. He was referring to the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, and he's indeed on record as saying that Israel should be wiped off the page of time. Now, you can interpret that in any way that you want, but I think the key question is that there is no intrinsic strategic conflict between Iran and Israel. As 2 countries, in fact, they have many commonalities from a pure strategic point of view, but in view of the ideological nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran, enmity towards Israel is a key component of their worldview. Now, whether that's, to what extent that's tied into their foreign policy and their defense doctrine, that's a different question. Now, on the specific point of defense doctrine, there you would make a major distinction between the 2 components of the Iranian military. Now, as far as I'm aware, Iran is the only country in the world that operates 2 totally independent military commands, one centered on the professional military, the other on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is not the equivalent of the Saudi National Guard or the former Iraqi Republican Guard. It's wholly different because it has an independent command. And it's not, it doesn't interface in any organic way with the regular Iranian military. Now, the regular Iranian military is an institution with at least 90 years standing. you can date it back to the early 1920s in the way its doctrines, its systems, its uniform was developed. And not a lot has changed since the Islamic Revolution. Some of the recruitment patterns may have changed, but certainly as an institution, it's pretty much. I mean, I don't know if you're from a British military background, but there's a very excellent book by a former British Army officer about the British military culture over the past 300 years, and the fact that it's hardly changed at all, even though the face may have changed in those 300 years, but the culture of that institution is the same. And you can apply that, I think, to the Iranian military. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is very different because, again, it has that ideological component. But they all of these organizations, they operate in a very clear context. And Iran is a nation state. In fact, it's a millennial nation state. And in my view, despite the fact that the state has developed an ideological component over the past 32 years, it is ultimately a very rational state. So the Israeli narrative that Iran is somehow, or at least one of the Israeli narratives, the kind of the right-wing Israeli narrative that Iran is set on Israel's destruction, I think in my view that's mostly, it's, for want of a better word, it's propaganda. I don't think they believe that themselves. The way that Iran has dealt with Israel over the past 30 years has been mainly through the use of proxies, and the template for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war. The withdrawal in the year 2000 was also important, and that was the culmination of a 16-year major insurgency by Hezbollah against Israel in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah successfully defeated the southern Lebanon army. And also the Israeli army itself. I mean, you can make that argument that withdrawal in 2000 was an admission of defeat. But the real template and the way that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard does its wargaming and the way they develop their doctrine, they use that as a template. And that was, by any standard, that was very successful use of a proxy force to, if not defeat, but at least deter a very powerful state with one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. So I hope I've answered your question. I think there are a lot of nuances in place. Now, on the question of the explosions at the depot, I think you come from the broadcasting media, so you have these short time frames. I think very interesting, actually, because I have very little doubt in my mind that the assassination of the Iranian scientists is the work of the Israeli Secret Service. In fact, I wrote an article on that with very strong sources. Mr. Lamont talked about people with clear motives. I think, it's very difficult to imagine who else would want to assassinate Iranian scientists. And a lot have died. At least 6 have been assassinated. A lot of them under threat of death. The real question there is that as part of the information gathering, are the Israelis also being assisted by other Western services? That's the real question with regard to that. And the explosion, although the Iranians themselves say that was an accident, it may not be, because one of the people who was killed was the gentleman, was the person who was the original godfather of the Iranian ballistic missile industry. And he was killed. So it could be an accident, but it may not be. And the reason why I say it may not be is because there have been quite a few of these explosions since 2003. Invariably, the Iranians say they're accidents. In fact, there was a plane came down in 2003, and something like 300-odd Revolutionary Guard commanders were killed. If that was an accident, then the Iranians are very shoddy with the way they treat their senior military commanders. So I think there's a real potential for sabotage, and I think the Iranians would like to underplay that for various reasons. State terrorism, I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure about the veracity of Seymour Hersh's article. I think certainly the Americans at a political level, they talk about supporting centrifugal forces in Iran, separatists, religious forces. Whether they really do so on the ground, that's debatable. The Americans certainly interface with secessionists. There's no doubt about that. In open conferences and in venues such as this, whether they do so behind the scenes is a different matter. But I certainly think that the assassination of Iranian scientists is state terrorism. That there's no doubt about that whatsoever. And also, I think the question of Stuxnet, the virus that targeted the enrichment facilities, that may also be construed as a form of state terrorism. I think from the information that I have, that technology was developed in combination by the Israelis and the Americans. And there are other viruses on the pipeline. the head of the cyber warfare division of the Revolutionary Guard, just gave an interview a couple of days ago elaborating on that. And Stuxnet was, as far as we are aware, the most potent form of cyber warfare to date. Well, we pushed for time, so I'll just leave it there and I'll let Mr. Dalton.
Thank you much.
Sir Richard? Thank you. I believe that the assassinations have less effect in the actual progress of the Iranian nuclear program than is sometimes claimed. The restrictions on acquisition of materials from overseas are much more significant, and I believe that these acts of aggression, both whether Stuxnet or assassinations, have deeply negative political effects and are, although I don't see anything other than overt sources clearly, I don't think they are contributing to the overall objective. That's all I'd like to say now. I think others have covered it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. I'm going to call on, I think I've got four here, Hosni Imam, and then the gentleman next to him, gentleman then in the fourth row, and then in the back at number 4, and then I've got one question of my own, so I think that might wrap it up. I got to get to my question.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Just very brief points to come back to Lord Lamont's remarks about Saudi Arabia versus Iran, all that. I believe if we come to facts, it was Saudi Arabia who was a victim of terrorism from Al-Qaeda more than anybody else. Secondly, there are Qaeda operatives actually being harbored in Iran. To come to the proxy war, I don't think this is a very honorable thing to have a proxy war and destabilize the region and provoke terrorism in the region as well in order to build your own strength and image. On the other hand, if we come to Iraq, the role Iran playing there is very negative and very subversive. And finally, what about Syria and the nexus between Syria and Iran? If Syria falls or Assad falls, what would be the impact on the Iranian regime? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
Jonathan Katzenellenberg, and I'm a freelance journalist. I was just wondering about the impact of the Green Revolution. It appears to have petered out, but I'm very surprised that no mention has been made today about it. Surely the Iranians must be slightly quivering if they do see their allies in Syria fall, and surely there must be something left in the Iranian Green Revolution. And after all, with the spread of with the surprising force of the Arab Spring, surely it can spread further eastwards. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the gentleman in the fourth row here.
This must be one of the very few occasions where there's such a high degree of consensus among the speakers about the need to change Western policy. And Sir Dalton said that's very urgent. I just wonder what the prospects of changing that successfully are. On the one hand, the Israelis are bursting on the leash about the military option, even though Pentagon may have second thoughts about this. And yet in the election year, is Obama going to risk a dialogue which is a meaningful dialogue with Iran? Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last question from the floor in the back on the edge here.
Dominic Dudley, freelance journalist. I just wonder what useful role Turkey might be able to play as a go-between between Iran and the West, possibly. From what I understand, a lot of the trade that Iran used to do with the rest of the world that went via Dubai, a lot of it now goes via Turkey, so there's greater trade links, and obviously diplomatically it's been getting more, flexing its muscle more around the region recently.
Thank you. And my question is about latency, which has been a subject that I think all speakers have touched on one way or another. What Iran has been seeking is not what Japan has. Japan has enrichment and reprocessing, but no evidence at all of any military connection. The IEA report showed in rich detail 65 paragraphs worth of military work that appears to be related to the development and research of nuclear weapons. So I think it was Sir Richard who said that Iran seems to be approaching the point where it has a capability. I think it probably already has a capability if it sought to take a political decision. So it already has a form of latency. If that is Mahan, Iran's quest, then surely they could cease and desist where they are now and put on ice the work for this time, what you said, 10, 20 years in the future, what others might think is more 1, 2 years into the future. The suggestion that sanctions just simply will not work to persuade Iran to make that decision to stop activity if they already, if in fact that is their objective. It's not clear to me why Iran could not make such a rational decision. Sir Richard, I no longer represent the U.S. government, so it's not my position to say whether Secretary Hillary Clinton believed what she said, but I think we can take it as read that when the U.S. government thinks, says that sanctions should have an impact, that they believe that they might, at least. Whether they will or not, of course, is hard to predict the future. But if Iran were to believe that the sanctions will only get tougher, if the kind of impact on business that Lord Lamont spoke of will only impede more and more the ability of honest, legitimate Iranians to conduct their business affairs, isn't it within the realm of possibility that Iran would make a decision to come to a negotiating table and to take up some of the confidence-building measures that Sir Richard outlined? Now, the last question, or one of the questions was, how possible is it that there could be any such diplomacy at this time is another question. But getting back to latency, if they already have it, why do they have to keep pushing? So with that, I'm sorry, that's my own long question. I'll go back and maybe we'll again, in the same order, ask the speakers to comment on any of the questions and comments raised.
Well, very, very quickly. The first question was about Saudi Arabia. Of course, it's right that Saudi Arabia has been a victim of terrorism itself. But of course, a lot of support from Al-Qaeda and a lot of financial support for Al-Qaeda has originated not from the government of Saudi Arabia, but from individuals or possibly minor members of the royal family. Funding has gone. And, we sometimes hear about Iran's encouragement of Shia groups in Iran or in Pakistan. But I would argue that the encouragement of Shia groups by Iran in those countries is very considerably less and has been much less effective and much less influential than that of Saudi Arabia. So, like it or not, and where precisely it comes from, Saudi Arabia has been deeply involved with Al-Qaeda. There are a lot of Saudis obviously involved in 9/11. There are Saudis in Guantanamo. There is not one Iranian in Guantanamo. And, I don't think we have the controversy over the bombing in Washington. But leaving that aside, it's a very long time since there have been accusations of Iranian terrorism in the West. I think, if you call it the West, the Buenos Aires synagogue, which was never proven, was a very, very long time ago. But all I was making was at the point, if you're talking about the influence that a country as a whole, has on terrorism, I can't quite understand sometimes why they're so obsessed with Iran and don't pay less attention to Saudi Arabia. That is my point. The Green Revolution and the Arab Spring. Well, I don't think that the Iranians are quite as terrified of the Arab Spring as Western commentators say. And I've noticed some neoconservatives in America talking about how the domino effect will spread to Iran, but somehow have no effect on Saudi Arabia. which has no pretensions to, Iran is an Islamic republic. It is not a secular dynastic regime as in Syria, as in Libya, nor is it a dynastic monarchical regime. And I think the perception of Iran is often different in the Middle East. And I think the Iranians themselves, even if they have many complaints and with great justification about their own government, I'm not sure that all of them see the regime as threatened by the Arab Spring. I mean, I believe in the end the Islamic Republic will have to change. It will change under the force of public opinion. But I don't see the Arab Spring as immediately impacting on that. Turkey, Iran, that is a very interesting subject. Turkey does not see Iran as the threat to regional stability that the West does. Turkey has engaged with Iran and, of course, is immediately criticized by the United States for engaging with Iran. Relations between Iran and Turkey have recently become less good because of Turkey's participation in the missile shield. I'm sorry, I didn't deal with the third question. I didn't exactly get it. And your question, Mark, if they have latency, why can't they stop? Well, I don't know whether they have, you call it latency, I just prefer to call it the threshold capability. I don't know that they have it or whether they don't have it. You referred to 65 compelling paragraphs in the report. Well, there are a lot of questions that Iran has to answer out of the IAEA report, but I would point out only 4 of the 65 paragraphs actually refer to after the year 2003, which was the year to which the National Intelligence report referred to, where they said that they had stopped this program in 2003. And those who have argued that although this report raises some disturbing questions, it does not actually provide a smoking gun, because considering how concern has grown with Iran's nuclear activities, it seems remarkable that there was only 4 out of 65 references to militarization or weapons design, which may not actually be illegal, were after 2003. So I'm not sure that I don't claim to be an expert in this, far from it, but I'm just reading other people's opinions. I'm not sure that it has been demonstrated that the NIE assessment was completely wrong.
Thank you, Mahan. And I'm sorry that we're running a little bit short, so if you could give a focused answer.
Well, if I may, I'll just address your question and also a question from the gentleman. I think with regards to latency, again, just echoing Mr. Lamont, I'm not entirely sure whether that latent capability is in place. But even if it was, there are degrees of capability. And I think that's the keynote here. So I think, but where I would have to disagree with you, with all due respect, is on the question of going further, actually transforming latent capability into actual capability. I don't think 1 or 2 years is a rational time frame in that. I think you have to look at a much longer time frame. And I think with these issues, the issue of the issue of posture is extremely important. And you can look at other nuclear weapons programs around the world over the past 50-odd years. Take a look at India and Pakistan. Both of them, over a very long period, developed the posture of nuclear weapon states. There are exceptions to that. South Africa, for instance, developing a bomb through a crash program, but that was very unsuccessful. They almost immediately gave it up. So a lot of work has to go into this from a software intellectual side in how you incorporate a new capability into your defense doctrine. And Iran hasn't even started that work, at least not in the public sphere. Now, on the question of the Green Revolution, I'm not entirely sure revolution is the correct characterization, but certainly there's a big political conflict inside Iran. And one of the better ways to understand it, I think, if you regard 3 key actors inside Iran bouncing off against each other. One is civil society. The other are the political actors, namely the reformists and the conservatives. The other is the security establishment. Now, all these 3 key actors have strategic and ideological components. In the past 2 years, their ideological component has been dominant, so they are locking horns all the time. But if these three actors operate, if they bring their strategic dimension to the core, I think you can have a very a peaceful transition in Iran politically. I don't believe regime change is very realistic. The current system in Iran is immovable, in my view, for the next 10, 15 years anyway. But certainly a political transition, that becomes readily available if these three actors, they bring to the fore their strategic dimension as opposed to their ideological dimension, where they are locking horns. And of course, the security establishment is dominant because they have all the muscle. They can put people in prison. They can repress. But look, as far as defense doctrine is concerned, as far as nuclear latency is concerned or nuclear weapons, whoever is in power in Iran is not going to do things much differently. I mean, I'm absolutely sure about that in view of my interaction with that country. And so I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sir Richard, you have the advantage of having the last word in today's discussion.
On Syria and Iran, I think the answer to the gentleman's question is that if Bashar al-Assad's regime fell, which may not be likely in the short term, Iran's strategic position would indeed be weakened, but it would still remain strong in the region overall. On latency, and to respond to you, Mark, I think there are 4 points that need to be made. First, those confidence-building measures that I mentioned and that you said could be helpful, they're not yet on offer. I mean, they're theoretical constructs. Secondly, in any negotiation, there has to be a quid pro quo. So Iran is not going to cease and desist now in return for some academic debate on whether or not those possibilities of confidence-building measures and limits and restrictions are ever going to be on offer. Thirdly, I still believe, this is a comment on the sanctions issue, that there is no internationally agreed sanctions formula out there sufficiently powerful to induce a change of Iranian behavior. I wrote that in 2008, and in the hope that we would see a more coherent and consistently pursued American response to the then breakdown in the negotiations. I'm all for, however, having this debate, and maybe we'll find that the American briefing of 2 reputable news outlets that neither sanctions on the Iranian Central Bank nor sanctions on Iranian energy exports are for discussion at the moment. But if there is going to be a discussion of additional sanctions, then let's use it intelligently. And if there is indeed a big stick, use it to initiate a discussion with Iran on the possibility of freezing the use of such a stick in return for a more serious attitude by Iran to the negotiations.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. On that note, I myself found this to be a most interesting, insightful, educational, and enjoyable exchange. I thank the speakers for leading it off. I hope we can continue this kind of discussion, not always focused on the hard topics, but some of the other ways in which we can try to put a little bit of optimism at a time of dire situation. So if you'll join me in thanking once more Lord Lamont, Mahan, Abedin, and Sir Richard Dalton. Thank all of you.